when you are exhausted on a mountain, when your legs are burning, when your lungs are pulling at air that isn't there, when every single cell in your body is screaming at you to stop. Everything you know about recovery tells you the same thing. Down. Rest. Let your body catch up. This is correct at sea level. This is correct in every gym, on every trail, in every athletic context you have ever been in. When you push too hard, you down, you recover, you continue. On a mountain above 7,000 meters, this logic kills you. Not metaphorically, not as a risk factor or a contributing element. Ing down on a high-altitude mountain, stopping to rest, reducing pace to recover, doing the thing that every physical instinct and every athletic experience tells you is the right response to exhaustion, actively accelerates the process that ends with you not coming home. And the mechanism is not obvious. It is not what most people assume. It is not that you run out of time, though that happens too. It is that your body, the same body that is begging you to down, is doing something very specific when you stop. Something that cannot be undone by rest. Something that gets worse the longer you stay still. And the experienced climbers who understand this, who have internalized it deeply enough that they keep moving when everything tells them to stop, survive at dramatically higher rates than those who listen to their body. The mountain is not punishing weakness. It is punishing the correct response to weakness. Stay with me, because once you understand the actual physiology behind this, why movement is medicine at altitude and stillness is poison, you will understand something about K2 and Everest and every high mountain that almost no documentary ever explains properly. If you're new here, subscribe before we go further. This channel goes into the real mechanism behind what happens at the edge of human survival. 2 seconds. Let's get into it. Let's start with what actually happens in your body when you stop moving at extreme altitude. At 7,000 meters and above, the air contains roughly 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level. Your body has spent weeks acclimatizing, producing more red blood cells, increasing respiratory rate, adjusting blood chemistry to extract more oxygen from each breath. These adaptations are real and they are significant. But they are not enough. Above a certain altitude, no amount of acclimatization fully compensates for the oxygen deficit. Your cells are still operating below their optimal threshold. Your blood is still delivering less oxygen than your tissue needs. The gap between supply and demand is never fully closed. And your body has a response to this gap. It is called hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. This is a reflex, automatic, involuntary, happening right now in anyone at extreme altitude, whether they know about it or not. When the lungs detect low oxygen in the air spaces, the blood vessels in the lungs constrict. They narrow. The body is trying to redirect blood flow toward the parts of the lung that have slightly more oxygen, to optimize the exchange. At sea level, this reflex is helpful. At extreme altitude, it becomes a problem. Widespread pulmonary vasoconstriction increases the pressure in the pulmonary circulation, the blood vessels between the heart and the lungs. The heart has to work harder to push blood through narrowed vessels. The right side of the heart, which handles pulmonary circulation, is under increased load just from existing at altitude. Now add movement. When you are moving, climbing, ascending, even descending at pace, your muscles are demanding oxygen from the blood. The cardiovascular system responds by increasing cardiac output. The heart beats faster. Blood moves faster through the entire circuit. The increased flow through the pulmonary vessels, even though they are constricted, maintains a certain minimum level of circulation. And now, stop. When you stop moving, cardiac output drops. The demand from your muscles decreases. The heart. Blood moves more letty through the system. And this is where the problem begins. Hit the like button if you're already seeing where this is going. One click tells YouTube to show this to more people who've never understood any of this. Blood at extreme altitude does something that fast-moving blood does not. It clots. Not in a dramatic, medically obvious way. In small vessels, in capillaries. Microthrombi, tiny blood clots, form in the smallest blood vessels of your extremities, your lungs, sometimes your brain. This happens for several reasons simultaneously. First, the blood of a climber at extreme altitude is already significantly more viscous than normal. The acclimatization process that produces more red blood cells is useful for oxygen carrying capacity, but it makes the blood thicker and more prone to clotting. Dehydration, which is almost universal at altitude because breathing is so rapid and dry air carries moisture away with every exhale, makes the blood even thicker. Second, blood flow means that clotting factors in the blood have more time to accumulate at any given point in a vessel. Normal blood flow washes clotting factors through before they can aggregate. Blood flow allows them to build up. Third, the endothelial cells that line blood vessel walls are themselves hypoxic at extreme altitude. Hypoxic endothelial cells produce more of certain molecules that promote clotting, and fewer of the molecules that prevent it. Everything at altitude pushes the blood toward clotting. Movement counteracts this by keeping blood flowing fast enough that clots cannot establish. Stillness removes that counteraction. And the clots that form when you stop, in the capillaries of your fingers, in the small vessels of your lungs, in the microvasculature of your brain, do not dissolve when you start moving again. They are there, blocking flow in vessels that were otherwise structurally intact, creating areas of ischemia, tissue cut off from blood supply, that will only become apparent hours or days later. Climbers who stop to rest on high mountains and then continue often do not know what stopping cost them until they are back at base camp, until the frostbite emerges, until the confusion that seemed like altitude fog turns out to be something in the brain that has been without adequate blood flow. The rest that felt like recovery was actually accelerating the damage. Subscribe if you haven't already. This is the channel that goes into this level of detail on what extreme altitude actually does to the human body. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Now let's add the thermal dimension, because this is the second reason that thinking down is so dangerous, and it works completely independently of the clotting mechanism. Movement generates heat. This is basic thermodynamics. Muscle contraction is inefficient. Roughly 75% of the energy from burning fuel in a muscle is released as heat rather than mechanical work. This heat is distributed through the body by the circulatory system and maintains core and peripheral temperature. On K2, or Nanga Parbat, or Annapurna, where temperatures at altitude can drop to -30, -40, -50 degrees Celsius with wind, this internally generated heat is a critical part of the thermal equation. It is not the only source of warmth. Clothing insulates, but it is a significant one. When you stop moving, internal heat generation drops dramatically. Your muscles are no longer burning fuel at the rate they were during climbing. The heat output falls. And this happens immediately, not gradually, not over minutes, but within seconds of stopping. Meanwhile, the environment is still pulling heat from your body at the same rate it was before. Wind still strips the warm air layer from your clothing surface. Conduction through your boot to the cold ice or rock continues. Radiation continues. The physics of heat loss does not pause because you have paused. So when you stop, the balance shifts. Heat generation falls. Heat loss continues. Core temperature begins to drift downward. At extreme altitude, where the cardiovascular system is already under stress and the blood is already thicker than normal, even a small drop in core temperature has consequences that compound the problems already described. Cold blood is more viscous than warm blood. A drop in core temperature of even 1 degree Celsius measurably increases blood viscosity, further increasing the risk of the microthrombi that were already forming from flow and altitude-thickened blood. Cold blood also carries oxygen less efficiently. The oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve shifts with temperature. At lower temperatures, hemoglobin holds oxygen more tightly and releases it less readily to the tissues. So stopping creates a cascade. Movement drops, heat generation drops, core temperature drifts down, blood becomes colder and more viscous. Oxygen delivery to tissues decreases, even as flow was already lagging. Clot risk increases. Tissue at the periphery, fingers, toes, ears, begins to cool below safe thresholds. Every element of this cascade feeds into every other element, and the climber, sitting on a rock or crouched in the snow, feels none of it directly. They feel tired. They feel the brief relief of not having to move. They feel the reassurance of a few deep breaths. They do not feel their blood thickening. They do not feel microthrombi forming. They do not feel core temperature drifting down by 0.5 degree. These things happen below the threshold of conscious sensation. By the time they become symptomatic, by the time the climber feels genuinely cold or notices their thinking is than it should be, the process has already been running for 10, 15, 20 minutes. Let me ask you something directly. If you were on a mountain right now, genuinely exhausted, and you knew that stopping would accelerate damage to your tissue, do you think you could keep moving? Or do you think the exhaustion would win? Answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know. Now let's talk about the psychological layer, because this is where it gets most interesting. The decision to down or stop on a mountain is not made by a normal brain. It is made by a brain that has been running on severely depleted oxygen for hours. A brain whose prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for abstract reasoning, risk assessment, and the ability to choose long-term benefit over immediate comfort, is among the first regions to be compromised by hypoxia. Research on cognitive function under hypoxia shows a consistent pattern. The capacity for future-oriented thinking degrades early. The ability to reason about consequences that are not immediately present becomes unreliable. Decision-making shifts toward the immediate, toward what the body is demanding right now, rather than what the situation will require in 30 minutes. The body is demanding rest. The hypoxic brain is less capable than usual of reasoning past that demand to the consequences of meeting it. And this is why the instruction that experienced high-altitude climbers give, keep moving, do not stop except to clip into ropes, do not sit down in the death zone, sounds brutal from sea level and feels almost impossible to follow on the mountain. Because on the mountain, the instruction is being given to a brain that is already struggling to override the most basic physical signal it receives. Stop, rest, recover. The best climbers have systems for this. They know before they leave base camp that they will feel like stopping. They have pre-committed to movement schedules. They will rest only at specific locations, only for specific durations, and they will keep those durations short enough that the thermal and circulatory consequences do not compound. They treat rest as a managed intervention, rather than a response to the body's signals. Because at altitude, the body's signals are not reliable guides to what the body needs. They are reliable guides to what the body wants. And what it wants will kill it. Let's bring this to specific, documented examples, because this is not theoretical. The 2008 K2 disaster, 11 climbers dead in under 24 hours, has been analyzed in more detail than almost any other high-altitude incident. Multiple investigations, survivor testimony, radio logs, and subsequent academic analysis have identified resting in place as a contributing factor in several of the deaths. Climbers who became separated from their teams in deteriorating conditions made the decision to stop and wait, rather than continue moving. The reasoning, reported afterward by those who survived and by radio communications before the deaths, was consistent. Moving in those conditions feels more dangerous than waiting. Technically, In terms of fall risk on a steep, icy slope in a storm, this is arguably true. Moving fast on steep, technical terrain in deteriorating visibility carries real risk. But the calculus ignores the motion disaster of staying still. Every minute stationary in those conditions, at that altitude, in the cold, blood viscosity increasing, peripheral temperature dropping, microthrombi forming, core temperature drifting. The storm that killed those climbers did not kill them instantly. It killed them through a process that stillness accelerated and movement might have. This is the most uncomfortable conclusion in all of high-altitude medicine, and it is almost never stated this directly. On K2, in a storm, the choice between moving and staying still is not a choice between a dangerous option and a safe option. It is a choice between two dangerous options, where one is invisible and the other is fast and obvious. The invisible one is more dangerous, and the mountain knows climbers will choose to avoid the obvious one. Let's close with what this means practically, and why understanding this changes how you think about extreme environments, even if you never go near a high mountain. The fundamental principle is this. At extreme altitude, the body's survival instincts are calibrated for a different environment. The signal to stop and rest evolved in conditions where stopping and resting worked, where the air had oxygen, where resting actually allowed recovery, where the thermal environment was not trying to freeze you solid while your heart rate returned to baseline. At 7,000 meters above sea level, those conditions don't exist. The signal fires anyway. And climbers who survive are the ones who have trained themselves, specifically, deliberately, with great difficulty, to treat that signal as information rather than instruction. The signal tells them they are tired. They accept that information. It does not tell them to stop, because they know that stopping is not the correct response to being tired in this environment. They keep moving. Not fast, not recklessly, but moving. Because movement is the only thing their body is doing that is actively working against the cascade. The thickening, the cooling, the clotting, the failure of the peripheral tissue that stillness accelerates. The mountain tests every instinct you have. And the instinct to rest, in this environment, is the one it uses most effectively. All right, you made it to the end. That means you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Here is what I need from you now. First, drop a comment telling me which video you want next. Option 1. Why your body feels warm right before you freeze to death on a mountain. The paradox that kills climbers who think they are recovering. Option 2. What the blood of a climber looks like under a microscope after 12 hours in the death zone, and why doctors are always shocked by the results. Option 3. Why K2 in winter has never been survived without supplemental oxygen, and what happens to the human body in conditions that make summer K2 look safe. Type 1, 2, or 3. I choose based on comments, and I genuinely mean that. Second, if this video gave you something real, hit the like button. It is how YouTube decides whether this content reaches people who have never heard any of it.